When I told my family I had breast cancer, my sister did something I'll never forget or forgive. My older sister, Victoria, had always found a way to make everything about herself. When I got pneumonia at 14, she suddenly started miscarrying a baby despite being a proud virgin. At my high school graduation, she announced her engagement, holding up a fake ring from a boyfriend that didn't exist. Last Thanksgiving, she literally interrupted my toast to give a longer one. 6 months ago, doctors told me I had breast cancer and that if I wanted to live, I needed surgery to remove both of my breasts. I was terrified, alone, and needed support more than ever. I told my family, thinking, surely, Victoria wouldn't make this about her. At first, she actually seemed genuinely supportive for the first time ever. She came to my doctor's appointments and took notes. She brought me my favorite cookies and sat with me while I cried about losing my hair from chemo. She held my hand when I was scared and told me I was going to beat this. I even felt guilty for spending so many years thinking she was selfish. 2 weeks before my scheduled mastectomy, we were having coffee at her apartment when she got really emotional. "I've been thinking so much about what you're going through," she said through tears, "and I've made a big decision. I'm getting a mastectomy too, in solidarity with you. You know how people shave their heads when someone has cancer? I'm doing something even more meaningful." I actually laughed, thinking it was a strange joke. But then Victoria pulled out her phone and showed me a surgery date 5 days before mine. She'd already met with a plastic surgeon. She'd even paid a deposit. She was completely serious. I tried to explain that this was insane, that I was having the surgery because cancer would literally kill me if I didn't, not to make a statement. But Victoria got offended and started crying harder. "I'm trying to show you're not alone. I'm sacrificing my body for you. I'm choosing to go through the same pain." I told her it wasn't the same at all, but she wouldn't listen. Over the next week, Victoria posted nonstop on social media about her upcoming surgery, her journey of solidarity, and how difficult the decision had been. She even started a fundraiser for her surgery costs, even though she didn't have cancer and insurance obviously wouldn't cover it. Strangers donated thousands, calling her a hero and an angel. She had her surgery first and acted like she was the first person in history to go through something hard. She posted hospital photos, tearful recovery videos, and long captions about her courage. Our mother stayed at her house for an entire week, helping her recover and cooking all her meals. When I had my actual cancer surgery 5 days later, Mom could only stay with me for 2 days. "Your sister still needs me," she said. "She's having such a hard time adjusting to her new body." I had drains coming out of my chest and could barely lift my arms, but I had to take care of myself because Victoria needed our mother more. At family dinner 2 weeks after both surgeries, our parents threw Victoria a party. They called it a celebration of courage, complete with a cake that had her name on it. Our aunt and uncle gave speeches about what an incredible person she was for choosing this when she didn't have to. I sat there with drains still in my chest from removing actual cancer. Not one person asked how I was feeling. Victoria stood up and gave a long, tearful speech about how hard it is to look in the mirror now, how she'll never feel like a woman again, but that it was all worth it to support her baby sister. Everyone cried. They called her a saint, a martyr. I tried to speak up, to say how absurd this was, but my dad actually shushed me. "Let your sister have this moment," he whispered. "What she did for you is incredible." That night, I found out a magazine had contacted Victoria about doing a feature story on her solidarity surgery. 3 days later, she called me crying happy tears. "You're not going to believe this," she said, her voice shaking. "A publisher reached out. They want me to write a whole book about my experience. They said my story of voluntary sacrifice is so inspiring." I just stood there holding the phone. "Will you help me write the book?" she asked, excited. My eyes suddenly lit up. "Of course I will," I said. "Come over. Let's discuss it." I hung up, my plan already forming. That evening, I tidied my apartment and set up my laptop on the coffee table, making sure my voice recorder app was open, but hidden behind my browser tabs. Victoria arrived at 7, wearing a flowing cardigan and carrying a brand new leather notebook. She hugged me at the door, practically vibrating with excitement about the book deal. I made us chamomile tea in the mugs my aunt gave me last Christmas, the ones with inspirational quotes about strength that now felt bitterly ironic. We sat on my worn couch as I opened a blank document on my laptop, positioning it so she couldn't see the file name I'd typed at the top. She launched into her vision for the book without me even asking, waving her hands, describing it as a memoir about sacrifice and sisterhood, about choosing solidarity over comfort. She wanted the cover to show two women holding hands, maybe in silhouette against a sunset, something that would make people cry in the bookstore. I typed everything she said word for word, watching her perform this twisted version of empathy while my surgical scars still ached beneath my shirt. She was completely oblivious to how insane it all sounded, describing chapters about her emotional journey and her decision to sacrifice her body. Not once acknowledging that my body wasn't a choice or a statement, but a medical necessity. I waited for her to pause for breath before asking her to walk me through her entire decision-making process. From the moment I told her about my diagnosis to the day she scheduled her surgery. Victoria's eyes lit up like I'd asked her favorite question in the world. She settled deeper into my couch and began her detailed story about her emotional journey. She talked about lying awake at night, thinking about my suffering and feeling helpless. She described researching mastectomies online, reading about prophylactic surgeries, and suddenly having this revelation that she could do something meaningful instead of just watching from the sidelines. I typed every single word, my fingers flying across the keyboard while my face stayed neutral and supportive. Every lie was documented, every exaggeration, every moment she centered herself in my cancer story while pretending it was about supporting me. She talked for almost 2 hours, describing consultations with her plastic surgeon, how she carefully chose her surgery date, and how scared she was to make such a brave choice. I created a file and labeled it Book Notes, knowing someday I'd need every single word of this conversation. When she finally finished talking, her tea was cold and my hands were cramping. But I had pages upon pages of her own words proving exactly what she'd done. Over the next week, Victoria sent me dozens of voice memos elaborating on different chapters she wanted to include. My phone buzzed constantly, each new recording another long monologue about her vision. She wanted an entire section focused on her pain during recovery, describing her drains, her medication, her sleepless nights. She barely mentioned that I was recovering from cancer surgery at the same time, treating my actual medical crisis as background context for her bravery. I spent hours transcribing every message, sitting at my kitchen table with my laptop, noting timestamps and saving each file in a folder labeled Victoria Voice Memos, organized by date and topic. She sent ideas at all hours, sometimes at 2 a.m., rambling about her feelings and her journey. I transcribed messages where she described looking in the mirror and grieving her lost breasts, never once acknowledging that mine were removed to save my life, while hers were a performance. By the end of the week, I had over 40 recordings saved and transcribed, each one more proof of her calculated exploitation of my cancer. I scheduled a follow-up appointment with my oncologist, Dr. Elena, and asked her to document my medical timeline in detail. She sat across from me with my thick file open on her desk, looking concerned about why I needed all this information. I explained that my sister was writing a book about her elective surgery, and I wanted clear documentation of the difference between medical necessity and cosmetic choice. Elena's expression shifted from confusion to anger as she realized what I meant. She provided copies of my pathology reports showing the cancer cells, my surgical notes detailing the mastectomy, and my treatment plan outlining the chemotherapy protocol. Every page confirming the medical necessity of my surgery and the fact that I would have died without it. I also asked her to note in my file that Victoria's surgery was purely elective, no medical indication, no genetic markers, no family history, nothing that justified a prophylactic mastectomy. Elena added a detailed note to my chart and printed a signed copy for me, her hand shaking slightly as she did. She told me she was sorry my family had failed me and that what Victoria did was deeply inappropriate from a medical ethics standpoint. Later, Victoria invited me to meet Irving, the literary agent who had contacted her about the book deal. We met at a downtown coffee shop with exposed brick walls and overpriced lattes, the kind of place where creative people have important meetings. Irving was in his 50s, with gray hair and expensive glasses, carrying a leather portfolio that matched Victoria's pristine notebook. I watched him grow more and more excited as Victoria performed her story, leaning forward, taking notes, hanging on every dramatic pause. She cried while describing how hard it had been to choose the surgery, dabbing her eyes with a napkin as Irving nodded sympathetically. He kept using words like powerful, inspiring, and groundbreaking, talking about how her story would resonate with readers everywhere. I smiled and took notes on my laptop, playing the role of the supportive sister helping with her project. My phone sat in my lap, the voice memo app quietly recording under the table, capturing every second of Irving's enthusiasm, Victoria's performance, and every exaggerated claim she made about her so-called sacrifice. When Irving mentioned speaking engagements and media appearances, Victoria practically glowed with excitement. I just kept smiling and typing, adding to the growing file of evidence. Around that time, I started attending a cancer support group at the hospital, a small circle of folding chairs and tissues on the table. Listening to people share their real struggles made Victoria's performance feel even more grotesque. A woman my age talked about her mastectomy and fear of recovery, while an older man described his wife shaving her head in solidarity, genuine acts of support, not publicity stunts. After the third meeting, I told the group leader, Natasha, about Victoria's solidarity surgery. Her horror said everything. She called it psychological abuse, stealing someone's cancer story for attention. For the first time, I felt seen. 2 weeks later, Victoria invited me over to work on her book proposal. She proudly showed me her fundraiser total, over $15,000 raised for her surgery. Then, casually, she admitted it had only cost $8,000 and she'd kept the rest for recovery expenses. I took screenshots of everything while she was in the bathroom, the totals, comments calling her a hero, every lie. Next, I reached out to Harvey, the journalist who'd written the original article about her. Pretending to help with the follow-up, I met him for coffee and he shared his notes and recordings. Listening to Victoria's exaggerated claims about surgical risks, pain, and recovery, I realized she'd fabricated almost everything. While he fetched more coffee, I copied his files to my flash drive, adding another layer to my growing case. When Victoria asked me to write the chapter about our childhood, she sent a list of happy memories she wanted included. I wrote 2 versions, one full of her false heroics and one honest, the truth about every time she hijacked my life for attention. The fake miscarriage during my pneumonia. The imaginary engagement at my graduation. The Thanksgiving toast she stole. Every moment recorded. I saved both versions of the childhood chapter, one labeled draft for Victoria and one labeled truth for my records. The next day, my mother called, cheerful as ever, asking if I was being helpful enough to Victoria. She reminded me how lucky I was to have a sister willing to make such a sacrifice, and even suggested I dedicate the book to her courage. I agreed pleasantly, typing notes into my file labeled Family Enabling Pattern. By the time we hung up, I had 3 pages documenting exactly how my family kept feeding Victoria's behavior. The next morning, I saw Victoria's new Instagram post, a photo of us working together with the caption, "Writing this book with my incredible sister." This journey is teaching me so much about love and sacrifice. Hundreds of comments praised her bravery and selflessness. I took screenshots of everything, saving them in a folder called Social Media Evidence. She'd posted 6 times that week, always painting herself as the hero. 3 weeks into the project, I texted her asking for copies of her medical records for accuracy. 2 days later, she dropped off a manila envelope filled with blurry, redacted pages. The surgery was labeled prophylactic mastectomy, but there was no mention of family history, genetic testing, or medical necessity, just patient-elected procedure in fine print. I copied everything for my files. Then I contacted a lawyer, Donald Terry, who specialized in fraud cases. Sitting in his office, I laid out all the evidence, her fundraiser, posts, medical papers, and my own records. He listened quietly, then said what Victoria did wasn't just unethical. It could qualify as medical misrepresentation and fundraising fraud. He agreed to review everything and told me to keep collecting proof. Before I left, he said he'd practiced law for nearly 3 decades and had rarely seen a clearer case of family exploitation. For the first time in months, someone was angry for me. The next morning, Victoria emailed me her draft introduction. I opened it and began to read. When I read the first paragraph of Victoria's draft, my hands started shaking. She wrote about sitting beside me during my diagnosis, holding my hand while the doctor said I had cancer. But she was never there. I went alone that day, May 15th, 2:15 p.m., heard the news, cried in my car, and called her later that evening. To be sure, I requested my medical records. The email confirmed only my oncologist, Dr. Shah, was present. No Victoria. I saved the document in a folder called Fabricated Scenes and highlighted every lie in her draft. During chemo that week, I met a woman named Jane who had ovarian cancer. Her sister, after testing positive for the BRCA mutation, quietly had preventive surgery and stayed by Jane's side. Hearing that made me furious. That was real support. Victoria's solidarity was performance. When Victoria called saying her publisher wanted to move up her book release and that she'd been invited to speak at medical conferences, I pretended to be happy. But I knew I had 4 months to finish gathering proof before exposing her. I organized my medical and financial records. My surgery and chemo had cost tens of thousands. Even after insurance, I still owed over $9,000. Victoria's elective procedure cost $8,000, and she raised $15,000 online, pocketing the rest. By Sunday dinner, sitting across from her in a new dress, I felt like I was dining in enemy territory. Victoria's reconstruction had fully healed. At Sunday dinner, she waited until everyone had food before announcing her book title, Choosing Her Pain, A Sister's Sacrifice. My father teared up, hugged her, and called her brave. My mother cried too. No one asked about my clear skin results or how I was handling chemo side effects. I sat there pushing food around my plate while they celebrated her story about my cancer. Later, I cried quietly in the bathroom, then returned smiling like nothing was wrong. The next week, I met Natasha, who ran my cancer support group, and showed her everything I documented: posts, medical records, finances, fabricated scenes, and Victoria's draft. Natasha told me about 2 other women whose relatives had exploited their illnesses and offered to connect me with them for statements. She said I wasn't just exposing Victoria, I was showing a wider pattern of harm. 2 weeks later, Victoria asked me to help with photos for her book's marketing. The photographer posed us to look supportive and sisterly, praising her courage while I hid my swelling and scars. Inside, I thought about how different the photos would look once her lies were exposed. That night, I compared her Instagram posts with my medical calendar. Every time she claimed to be in pain, I was actually undergoing treatment. I made a spreadsheet and saved it as timeline evidence, backed up in 3 places. 2 days later, a magazine writer called for a beautiful story about Victoria's sacrifice. I realized she had no idea the surgery was elective. I stayed polite, declined the interview, and took her contact info in case I changed my mind. I added the journalist's contact info to my media file, noting the planned narrative angle. The next Tuesday, Victoria met me at a coffee shop, thrilled about her book contract, a $50,000 advance, with $17,000 already paid. When I asked what she'd done with it, she pointed to a new silver BMW outside, saying she deserved it after everything she'd been through. I smiled, took photos of the contract pages, and thought about my $60,000 in medical bills. At my next appointment, I told Dr. Shah how Victoria's behavior was affecting my recovery. She noted that family stress was complicating my treatment and offered to write a letter describing the harm if I needed it. I added that to my growing evidence file. Weeks later, Victoria texted saying several talk shows wanted her story and asked if I'd appear with her. I agreed. More publicity meant more proof would surface. The next morning, she emailed her new book proposal. My heart stopped when I saw photos of my own post-surgery chest, pictures she'd stolen from my phone. I called my lawyer, Donald Terry, who confirmed it was a privacy and copyright violation. That afternoon, my aunt called, praising Victoria and mentioning the church had raised $3,000 for cancer research in my name. I called the church office. They said Victoria had collected the money herself, but no one knew where it went. I documented everything. The following week, I attended a publishing workshop that explained how publishers can be held liable for false memoirs, especially those tied to donations or sympathy campaigns. It changed my strategy. I didn't need to go public yet. I could go directly to the publisher. 2 days later, Victoria sent another draft, describing her sacrifice in dramatic detail, saying goodbye to her body in the mirror, claiming she chose pain out of love for me. I read every line, saving it all as evidence for when the truth came out. I read Victoria's new chapter, and then revisited my own journal from my cancer surgery, the real fear, the medical necessity, the uncertainty of waking up. She'd stolen that pain and turned it into fiction. Sickened, I saved her draft beside my entries as proof. The next morning, I emailed her plastic surgeon's office posing as a researcher and asked about prophylactic mastectomies done without medical cause. They confirmed such surgeries are considered cosmetic and not covered by insurance. They even sent an official letter, which I added to my evidence. 3 days later during chemo, I broke down and told my nurse everything, the fake surgery, fundraiser lies, and the family's praise for Victoria. Horrified, she said it was emotional abuse disguised as support and offered to write a professional statement validating my experience.